This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. It's been just over a decade now since I graduated high school. Many of those lessons in classes that at the time seemed so crucial and important have become pretty hazy memories. These days I'd really have to dive deep down to remember the names of all the parts of the cell, or the exact way to play the national anthem on a plastic recorder. There are some lessons though that are burnt into my brain. Some lessons that I still take with me to this day. And one of those came from a homework assignment given out by my Year 10 history teacher on a hot Friday afternoon. The question was, what one thing defeated Hitler, Napoleon, the Kaiser, Xerxes the Great, and Caesar? So I went home and I racked my brain for the entire weekend, seeing if weather patterns, birthdays, terrain, see if anything matched up, but nothing clicked. The question eluded me. So after admitting defeat, I skulked into class on Monday morning, the question still emblazoned on the whiteboard from Friday. 12 hours work and I was still no closer to when I started. Mercifully though, the teacher began the class by answering the question, what one thing defeated Hitler, Napoleon, the Kaiser, Xerxes, and Caesar? The answer? Economics. It was the Germans' lack of resources that brought them to the ultimate end. It was Xerxes' destroyed supply chains in the Aegean. It was Napoleon's overextension that brought untimely ends to the armies that seemed to be, to many, unstoppable at the time. The teacher then pointed out that even the most zealous fighter in the world can't achieve much without bullets in his gun. Economics drives victories, and it's still something I hold very central to this day. So with that in mind, why can't we use economics to win our current wars? Why can't we starve our enemies of food and supplies and weapons the same way the Allies did to Germany in World War I? Why can't we bankrupt groups like Al-Shabaab and ISIS or JNIM? Surely their money goes into banks, and we can seize those banks. We can take their money, because without money, where would they buy ammunition from? How is it that we had the capability to cut off all of Germany from receiving a single shipment of key supplies, but we can't stop Al-Shabaab from receiving money from all over the world? How are these terrorist groups funded, and why can't we simply just cut them off? Well, as always here at The Red Line, that answer is complicated. But to help us dig into the complexity that is the role of international finance in terrorism, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Cash for conflict.
When it comes to terrorist funding, we really got to look at a couple of different things. First off is we have to put in our mind, this is about quantum of money. So, when we sort of look at something like, if we go back in time and look at September 11 and the attacks there, they weren't expensive attacks. So even those sorts of coordinated attacks by cellular structured terrorist groups, to undertake an attack is really, you're talking tens of thousands, maybe $100,000. Okay, now fast forward into this day and age of lone actors. And what we see here is, in some cases, so for instance, in the case recently, late last year in New Zealand, where a known terrorist offender stabbed a number of people, he picked up a knife and he didn't even pay for it in a supermarket. So we have to put in our mind here, if we're talking terrorism writ large, okay, the underlying money required to undertake a terrorist attack is rather small. Now, if we're talking about terrorist groups writ large, and you're going to run large ones, what we see is quite diverse ways of funding. So, okay, in some cases, and let's go back in time again, let's think about the IRA before the peace process and when they were the PIRA. They did everything from running guns into Europe through to selling illicit drugs, through to, quite often it was very difficult to tell the difference between the IRA and organised crime. Now, they also took large amounts of donations. Now, that money was laundered through the international finance system. So, yes, you see some of those, but for every organisation that does that, we see many, many smaller organisations who use less sophisticated means. So, if you're looking at Hamas and Hezbollah's fundraising in South America and Central America, what we see is, they're involved in everything from the production and distribution of cocaine to the production and distribution of illicit tobacco products. So incredibly complex business systems. And it seems to be, and I might add, it seems to be from my perspective that the longer an organisation is in operation, the more complex their structures tend to be. In terms of JI, though, we see JI and Jamaat Islamiyah in our region, and we see that, as a result of the disruption activity, they're the exception to that sort of observation, because what we see with them is relatively unsophisticated funding mechanisms. Now, if we go now down into the southern Philippines, what we see there is, a real merging of, say, the Abu Sayyaf group with general organised crime, and trying to unpick the two. Is the ASG a organised crime group or a transnational serious organised crime group with terrorist tendencies, or are they a terrorist group with transnational serious organised crime tendencies? So I think the best thing in this thing is really engaging with the complexity of it. So trying to draw these huge, long swathing generalizations is really, really difficult. And so as a result of that, I think what really is important is talking specifics about specific organisations. Now, in terms of mitigation, which is the other side, of the flip side of this discussion, strengthening the international finance sector is critical. You can't raise, so for instance, if I'm going to use illicit tobacco to raise funds to undertake terrorist attacks in the Middle East, then I have to move value from wherever I'm manufacturing those goods to pay for their manufacturing to markets, and then get the money back from markets back into where I need it to purchase capability. So from that perspective, the international finance sector and putting in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing arrangements becomes critical. Now, some of the big things in that have become, this whole thing for finance, the finance sector taking responsibility for that. So, this is issues like know your customer and know your customer's customer. So there's a lot more focus internationally, and certainly in the Western liberal democracies and those components. So, if you look globally, if you talk to big financial players in the finance sector, they'll all tell you they're concerned about US counter-terrorism, anti-money laundering measures and the sanctions that go along with them.
Dr. John Coyne is the head of strategic policing and Northern Australia policy for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He's also the former head of ASPI's Border Force program and is the author of The Role of Strategic Intelligence in Law Enforcement. On top of that, he's also a very great friend of the show, and we're thrilled to have him back on today.
It gets far more complex when you have financial organisations, banks and others. And you've got to remember here, it's not just banks, because what we're talking about is moving value. It does get far more complex to track transactions across non-compliant or deliberately non-compliant organisations. But what I would say to you is this, is that increasingly what we're seeing is across the finance sector, we're seeing a greater interest for concern out of legitimate transactions. So even if you're talking about any of the financial institutions that you have mentioned, okay, even if you're talking about them, they remain concerned about their capacity, so their legitimate business capacity to engage with the US market. So they have concerns. So you're seeing this, it is a global finance sector. And so you are seeing banks and other players in the finance sector increasingly complying with the requirements for concern over being found wanting and impacting on their profitability. So the other thing to remember is as much as there's a lot of money to be made in terms of transnational serious organised crime and the laundering of money, there's nowhere near as much money to be made from terrorism financing. And I think that's the other component of this. So quite often, what we're talking about here is finding relatively small transactions, and that seems to be the bigger challenge than non-compliant parts of the finance sector.
Before the takeover of Afghanistan, the Taliban were only pulling in around a couple of $100 million per year. And a group like JNIM in West Africa only pulls in, by one estimate, just under $50 million per year total. When you compare that against something like the US, who spent over $1 trillion in Afghanistan, these numbers are drops in the bucket. How can these organizations run so cheaply when it's so expensive to combat them?
Look, what I'd say to you is that their administrative trail or chain and administrative costs are significantly less, and even the adoption. Let's for a second here. Let's talk about the adoption of technology. So, small non-state actors can rapidly acquire new technology and take risks and buy at a cut price rate far quicker than, for instance, the 3 years that would take a Australian Commonwealth agency to go through and check, the actual capability, go through all of the accreditation processes. And I use that nominally, but my point here is that all the testing, all the security approaches, all that aside, all the administration that we have within government makes it far more expensive to adopt capability than what you would find in smaller organisations. So I think that's part and parcel of the problem here. And so the other part is that, it's very, in some of these places, the cost of living and paying of foreign fighters. So let's go back and look at in the times of IS, people were talking about IS fighters like internationals being paid. They weren't being paid, like a private soldier's salary equivalent in this, for instance, like the Australian Army. They're not being paid $60,000 or $70,000 a year and provided free health. So I think this is where we're sort of, we've got to sort of mix. We're trying to compare apples with oranges. So, it does, relatively speaking, it is far cheaper to be able to operate an organisation such as JI or AQ or IS than it is to operate a fifth-generation warfighting military capability.
So can you take us through how banks actually track these monetary donations? As a bit of a thought exercise here, how does a bank distinguish me giving $20 to ISIS fighters against me, let's say, giving $20 to a friend of mine who I'm playing online games with who might just happen to live in Syria?
And look, this is part and parcel of that big challenge. So, one of the key processes in all of this is the sharing of information and intelligence and the debanking of bad actors. And I think this is something that the finance sector from Australia to the US, from the US to London have been particularly effective at over the last several years, which is identifying those accounts and those destinations where there's a high risk of those people acting as bad actors. So we've seen a real process of debanking of those bad actors, whether be they terrorists, be they organised crime figures, or be they those members of governments who are slowly bleeding out through corruption, national wealth. So we're seeing I think one of the key processes. But you've hit the nail on the head here, which is, this is a numbers game. Okay, and this is a game of, I always said, and I think you and I have discussed this before, which is, I'm a qualitative guy. I started my career in intelligence doing human source interrogation type work. Welcome to the 21st century where, in terms of intelligence work, far more of it is done exactly as you're describing it, which is, how do we identify that the $30 that someone's, 16-year-old kid is sending via some payment platform, be it PayPal or elsewhere, communicating on a games platform, playing Fortnite. And how do we know that that's not going into terrorist funding? And I think this is part of that, this is the mass data. This is we sort of talked about big data a long time ago. It's nothing new. But when in terms of acknowledging what the intelligence challenge here is with CT funding, it is going through, we used to say going and looking for a needle in a haystack. But really what it is looking at a perpetually growing number of moving haystacks for a needle. And I think that is the biggest challenge. So I think it's still, denying criminal groups their profits, denying terrorist groups access to finance is critical. But we have to also be realistic about diminishing returns on this, which is that the more legislation and the more difficult you make it for compliance, the more difficult it is for the finance sector to comply with those requirements and to do so proactively. And, I appeared before a Senate inquiry just recently on this late last year and talked about it, and that we ought be, and certainly in the Australian context, putting in hard counterterrorism, anti-money laundering requirements may come at the detriment of encouraging the finance sector to take really innovative approaches to discovery. So what I mean there is that, what do we want them to do? Be 100% compliant with legislation, or do we want them to find an increasing number of bad actors? Now, I would suggest the intent of the legislation is to find the bad actors and to deny them finance. So in some ways, encouraging, for instance, and which isn't the case at the moment, encouraging a bank or a financial institution to, and providing with a concession, to undertake more proactive or innovative approaches to data mining their organisation's transactions to look for suspicious transactions may in fact be more proactive and more beneficial than simply ticking off a shopping list of legislative requirements. And I think this is where we're at now, which is, and one of your points you made earlier about non-compliant financial institutions is really the key to this, which is what we want to work. Nations want to work with the finance sector to identify these bad actors and remove them from the financial system. So we want to debank them. And that requires not just legislation, it requires collaboration, which has not always been the approach of AML regimes.
So the government can come and arrest an individual when they find proof that they've been donating and supporting terrorist organisations. But what do they do when they find out it's a state actor or a rival intelligence service or even someone like Iran or North Korea? You can't really arrest North Korea, so what do you do when you find they're giving money to terrorist organisations?
It'd be nice to say that the international system as a whole would allow us a multilateral or allow multilateralism to enforce these requirements. But increasingly, that's not been the case. So, for instance, taking things to the United Nations and working through, and we've seen this play out with the World Health Organization in terms of COVID. I think in some ways, minilateralism, which is, and I hate the term, a coalition of interested parties with the same ambitions working together to address those sorts of issues is really quite critical. But the other thing is being quite realistic about it. I mean, let's be quite frank. I mean, number one is what you're describing is an absolute finding a smoking gun that proves, a clear link between a terrorist organisation and, say, Iran. That's not always been the case, and that's been very, very difficult to find those smoking guns. Secondly is there is a difference between, and I've had these discussions in the past. So, for instance, when is an activity state-sponsored and when is an activity engaged with by a member of the state? So, and sometimes that's really complex in some of these countries. So, I look at this years ago in terms of Iran and the production of methamphetamines globally. So were the Iranians complicit in the Iranian government complicit in the manufacturing and distribution globally of an illicit drug, or were some members of the Iranian government involved in the production and distribution, or at least the value chains of for illicit drugs? And I think these are things that are really difficult, Michael, to sort of etch out and find an absolute answer to that. So my point is that these things, and again, not to sound like a broken record, but I think these things have to be looked at on their merits, and we can't just sort of draw a line and say, this is how we approach it with sanctions only, or this is how we're going to approach a problem. What we need to do is look at specific examples. So In a hypothetical, if Iran were to be sponsoring a specific terrorist group, and there were specific evidence of that, then a range of responses would need to be put in place to encourage them or to discourage them from continuing to do so, and holding them to account for doing so.
Obviously, I can't speak for every country as laws are different. But in Australia and the US, you can donate to political parties, religious groups, even private projects, all without any problems. So how does the law distinguish between a terrorist group and, let's say, a vocal religious group? If I were to donate money to a known, officially designated terrorist group, what would I be charged with?
Look, I want to put in mind, if you were to do that, and anyone who is listening to this podcast were to do that, there would be a range of laws in Australia. So if you were doing that from the Australian jurisdiction, there would be a range of Commonwealth laws in which you would be able to be prosecuted on, mostly under the Commonwealth Crimes Act. But, my point is there's plenty of legislation there to be able to address that issue. Where it gets more complex is where we're seeing in jurisdictions where the rule of law is under far more challenging requirements, or where the AML or anti-money laundering regimes are more difficult. Now, to take it off the counter-terrorism focus and put it just in a broadly anti-money laundering process, the issue there or the example there is the increasing number. So there's about 280 casinos operating across Southeast Asia, many of which have been implicated in money laundering. So the King's Roman Casino has been listed by the US Treasury Department for money laundering and continues to operate in the Golden Triangle. This is where the real difficulty of that legislation is how do you enact that in a jurisdiction that is far, and it's more than just the finance sector, and it's more than just the banks. It's, how do you address that in that jurisdiction? And I think this is where it gets far more complex. And secondly is on new and emergent technologies. We've had the Telephone Intercept Act in Australia, originally written in the early 70s when everyone had a copper phone line, and it's been systematically updated in legislation ever since. Now, there's a comprehensive review re-looking at it because of the very nature of communications. So, today I'm talking to you and recording this with you on Zoom. I guess if I pulled my phone, your phone out between us both, we'd have, Messenger, we'd have Telegram, we'd have a whole range of other capabilities. So communications has changed significantly, and in the finance sector, the movement of wealth and value has substantially changed. Like I said, we have everything earlier. We have everything from people communicating on games platforms as a mechanism of communication, and moving value from everything from cryptocurrencies through to gaming value. So I think here is where it gets really, really complex, where there's new systems that fundamentally change how value and how communication are done, is how we address those. And they, at the moment, I'm middle-aged, so for most of your listeners, I'm sure they're much younger than I am, they're more accustomed to rapid change, and because they've essentially their whole life has been that way. But we're seeing this accelerated rate change of technology, and yet the way we approach these problems, the legislative approach, doesn't quite work. So, we have fundamental shifts in technology while the legislators sort of look there and go, okay, how do we take the 1970s Telephone Intercept Act and slightly tweak it to make it suitable for, social media or all the new mechanisms of communication. And the finance sector, it's not too dissimilar as well. And the funny thing about it is that I guess, and also laid over the top of it is, how do we get it to go forward and at the same time deal with the re-emergence of, more traditional cultural banking systems and so to my mind, there's sort of the legislative system itself and how we amend legislation and bring about change in Western liberal democracies, and especially Australia, really needs a review. So, for instance, and a review is a very throwaway line. What I mean is that I think it needs a fundamental shift, because we're sort of seeing this, and we've seen it across the board in that law enforcement space. So, synthetic drugs is a good example. So, what I do is, and for a long time it was like this, I slightly modify the chemical composition of a synthetic drug, and now it's not listed, so therefore I can move it across borders. So then you've got to put a new piece of legislation in, and then I changed it again, and by the time, this is sort of cat and mouse routine. So, and to put it, I know with Redline, there's a lot of military people here, people who are interested in the military side, national security. But think of it as the old-fashioned OODA loop, okay? The observe, orientate, decide, and act. Today, our conversation has really been looking and going, okay, what do we do about AML? And what's being done about AML in terms of counterterrorism financing. The bigger question is how do we close, or I would propose to you first off that the OODA loop, observe, orientate, decide, act, is bad actors have got faster in their OODA loop, and our OODA loop, as in terms of Western liberal democracies, and, is much slower. So the time gap between the two has increased. So the bigger question here is in terms of AML and counterterrorism financing, how do we close that OODA loop? And so part of that answer is a really good intelligence. Finally, though, is that we need a new system. We need to think about it. And what I'm saying here, though, is not a binary suggestion that we throw privacy and human rights out the window and focus on security. Quite the contrary, is how do we bring all these things together in a meaningful way and speed that process up and avoid making mistakes. Now, that's a huge challenge. And in terms of AML and counterterrorism financing, the very approach of government legislating the finance sector needs to change. So we also need to, I spent a lot of time over the last couple of years meeting and talking with very senior people from the finance sector, okay, and they are very much interested in ensuring their compliance, and not, just by the letter of the law compliance, about, how can they make a meaningful contribution. So they need to be in the room as part of that discussion as well.
When you start to look at these much more geographically focused terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab or JNIM or JI, most of their money comes from cash operations like roadblocks, kidnappings, local taxes, and even smuggling operations. Surely at some point they need to put their money into a bank, so they aren't walking around with suitcases full of millions of dollars. And if these guys are using the banking system, then why can't we crack down on them more easily?
Look, that again is it's a complex question, because you're sort of how does everyone do that? Well, each of those are really quite different. So, if we were looking at, in the tri-state area of Southern America, we'd turn around and say, well, you know what, a lot of it is done with cash, but a lot of it's done through very complex banking systems and trade-based money laundering. In comparison, I would suggest to you in many parts of the Middle East where that sort of money is being moved around, traditional banking systems are used to transfer that wealth. And that's been proven in the past. We've seen this in terms of evidence of, evidence of the banking systems, Middle Eastern banking systems being used even in Sydney to transfer value. So I think there's a lot of that sort of componentry goes on. But ultimately, that cash has to re-enter the system. It has to come somewhere back in, and this is the fundamental problem for transnational serious organised crime, and it's a fundamental problem for organisations like AQ, IS. You have to be able to move value beyond cash. And the second component, though, is the minute they do so, that creates a weakness because, there's a very policey saying. If you speak to most federal level police officers in Australia or, FBI in the US, they'll always say it's been a catch cry in law enforcement. In fact, Metpol in the UK is the same way, which is, follow the money. And the other part about it is denying them criminal profits. In Australia, one of the great things that have really benefited law enforcement have been unexplained wealth. So, the ability to knock on someone's door and say, well, hold on a second, your annual tax rate, shows that you only pay, only earn $10,000, but you're sitting in a $50 million house and you're driving, $200,000 or $300,000 motor vehicles with boats and other things. If you can't explain where they came from, then we're going to take that from you. And I think this is one of the challenges for organised crime and terrorist groups is that once their value Well, once that money hits the legitimate banking system and crosses borders, it's then exposed and able to be targeted. And I think that's in benefit. So back to answer your question is that you answered it partly yourself at the start. These organisations run on a shoestring, but they still have to. Not everything can be done in cash. As a result of that, that's becoming a weakness that they can't get around. It's very hard to use that sort of level of cash unless all of your business, all of your activities is in a single jurisdiction which only uses cash. So an example of this would be, say, Somalia. But still, if you want to buy ammunition, if you want to buy other capabilities and you're in Somalia, you've still got to move to pay for those in an external jurisdiction. So that's, again, it's very hard for them not to touch the international finance sector now.
It's 1812, and Napoleon's army has taken over the crucial Russian city of Moscow. Any army who has gone head-to-head with Napoleon's Grande Armée has been crushed, and many European leaders at the time thought it would be impossible to ever defeat him. The Russians, though, as we all know, did defeat him, because they had one simple tactic: starve Napoleon to death. Rather than going head-to-head with Napoleon, he attacked their supply lines, he cut off their communications, and used scorched earth tactics to make sure Napoleon had no resources to keep himself supplied. The Russians let Napoleon's Grande Armée wither and die rather than fighting them head-on. And this is the strategy countries are now trying with various terrorist groups, trying to use the advantage of the fact that most transactions and communications go through international networks to find them, intercept them, and then cut them off. Trying to use the tactic of starvation for these terrorist groups. But how successful has it been? As terrorist groups can fundraise in so many ways, ranging from tolls on roadblocks, to kidnapping, to transporting drugs, to simply lending out men as guns for hire. How can a bunch of bankers and policy analysts hope to possibly starve these often self-sustaining units? Well, for that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. A revolution in a suitcase.
Terrorism is financed by multiple methods, and it is continuously adapting to our efforts to stop it. So it is an incredibly evolving scenario in which terrorists will start off, say, in a traditional banking system that's not looking for them. But after 9/11, all of the banking institutions actively sought to participate with, the FBI, for example, to stop terrorism in their tracks because it had such a substantial impact on them from, the attacks on September 11, 2001. And then it has morphed since then. So whether it's then them shifting to the informal banking system of the Hawala, to the advent of money that can be exchanged on cell phones, many of which started in developing countries, like M-Pesa, for example, in East Africa, all the way up into including cryptocurrency. So it is not something we're ever going to be able to say we have completely wrapped our hands around, because as soon as we do, there'll be another way to get out of our grasp. So if I was going to sum it up, it is a continuous effort to stop those who want to fund extremist action, terrorism, to make sure that they can't do that.
Mick Mulroy is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for the Middle East. He's also a retired CIA paramilitary operations officer in the Special Activities Center and the United States Marine Corps. He's a senior fellow for the Middle East Institute, an ABC News national security analyst, and co-founder of the Lobo Institute, as well as being on the board of advisors for Plato's Academy in Athens. On top of that, he's also a member for the Counterterrorism Study Group at the Atlantic Council. We're very pleased to have Mick join us today.
So in the last 20 years, the United States has undertaken a massive security assistance program in Iraq and Afghanistan to build up a conventional force. Both our own being there and then building a force to kind of mirror it in the Afghan National Army and the Iraqi Army, both of which were incredibly expensive. But they were fighting organizations of which were under a completely different model, more of a militia, more of a We just need enough to be able to fight and maintain an insurgency, if you will, against this overwhelming force. So for terrorists, whether it's ISIS, for example, in Syria, whether it's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or Hezbollah, but these organizations tend to do things much cheaper. So I've advocated that we should build a partner force that is in line with their type of military capacity. Because when the United States decides to leave, the forces that we built in our mirrored images tends to collapse. And I think we've seen that 2011 in Iraq against ISIS, and we saw that in Afghanistan recently against the Taliban. It is cheaper to run an insurgency, and therefore they don't have to do as much to raise money to keep it going. They essentially have to keep soldiers paid, and quite frankly, a lot of these soldiers don't have alternatives, so they can pay them quite little. And Shabab's a good example, they basically have set up a series of checkpoints of which function as tolls if you want to move goods or people around the areas they control, and they use that to fund their operations. And that's fairly minimal compared to a large government that doesn't have the ability to just hire very few people to do.
These organizations are largely cash operations, but that means they do have to keep their money somewhere. I don't usually see terrorists walking around holding giant suitcases worth of cash, so at some point they probably have to bank it to pay for things. If their money does enter a bank, why is it so hard to crack down on it?
So ever since I was in Somalia in 2012, they've had some version of this cell phone-based person-to-person exchange of some kind of currency. That's, to my knowledge, still in existence. I don't know that goes through any kind of banking system, right? So, right after 9/11, like I mentioned, there was a strong private-public partnership between banks and the intelligence and law enforcement. I think that cracked down pretty hard. There's a lot of ways to go around banking, and it might get more complicated now with all these different type of cryptocurrencies. But that is one of the things that we're going to have to evolve to be able to deal with, because terrorist operations are relatively inexpensive. I mean, you could say, if you went back and looked at the 9/11, that was an expensive endeavor of training and moving people. A lot of the terrorist attacks now are not on the Al-Qaeda model, which is giant, large-scale, impactful, whereas ISIS is perfectly fine to radicalize an individual in a country, say in Australia or the United States, and simply tell them, do you own a truck? Yes. Do you have gas? Yes. Well, then you can be a terrorist. You can run through a crowd of people, a festival, and it costs them almost nothing. Essentially it is just finding somebody who is inclined to do these horrible things and then is willing to essentially throw their life away in doing it. So that's a different model. That's not what we saw on September 11th, where, training people to be able to fly, maybe not land, but to fly aircraft, and then doing the entire planning and getting these teams in place. So part of it is evolving and adapting to the way terrorists finance their operations, and part of it is their ability to find ways to do terrorist acts that essentially don't cost as much as they have in the past.
Finding cash traveling to these groups is often like trying to find a needle in a moving haystack. So can you take us through how these banks actually manage to differentiate between sending someone $20 who's a friend overseas to funding a terrorist organization?
From what I've seen in my past experience, there's multiple ways to do that. Often you certainly, if you're going to fund directly a terrorist organization, it's likely the banking system or the intel services or law enforcement will pick it up for them. But there's other means to do it. So you could fund, say, a religious-based facility that happens to have an association with a terrorist organization, and that the funding of the religious facility provides them food or housing or something else. So it's essentially financing one thing on paper that it supports, maybe directly or indirectly, a terrorist organization. The other way is you recruit people who have independent, for example, in my country, in the U.S., there's obviously extremist elements on both far sides of the political spectrum. A lot of the individuals they recruit come with their own finance. They can pay their own way to get there. They can pay for whatever they need to bring, and they can pay for their own communications. That's another way for essentially is skirting around the need to fund an operation going through some kind of banking system.
It's a pretty open secret in the intelligence community that some banks run cleaner operations than others. Some banks, like a particular certain German one I won't name here, are pretty widely known to readily look the other way, particularly when it comes to real estate money laundering. These banks will pay government some lip service and catch a few of the small fish every now and again to prove they're doing something, but how do we get them more invested to help governments and actually prevent some of this large-scale money laundering?
One of the reasons why I started with the strong public-private partnership that happened after 9/11 is I think everybody saw that it was in their interest, whether it was the banking, the international financing community, obviously law enforcement, intelligence. It was in their interest to cooperate. So for the banks to find out how to stop these people, and then for investigators to be able to be essentially embedded in the banks to be able to weed out these bad apples. That was 20 years ago. So now I think people maybe forgot how they felt or the impact of an attack like that. And they're looking for ways to, increase their bottom line, and what are we going to do about it? So there has to be consequences, right? So if they have decided that it's in their financial interest to perhaps look the other way on certain things, then the international community and the Financial Action Task Force, for example, which is a group that's really designed to look at this. It includes 37 countries and a couple of international organizations. They should be setting the policies for how these banks should operate. And if they get out of line, then there has to be some kind of consequences. I mean, if there's not consequences, then I think we'll be, pushing the proverbial rock up the hill to only see it roll back down. We're going to have to have collectively specific rules and regulations for how banking deals with these individual groups. And if they are not following, there needs to be financial consequences and potentially criminal consequences if it gets to that level.
When ISIS was at its peak of caliphate, Western countries were very openly putting sanctions on them, and the war was quite intense, and obviously everyone openly refused to buy from ISIS. At that point, ISIS then flooded the market with very cheap oil from their conquered territories, and some of this oil was bought by NATO allies on the down low to put into their own domestic markets. How do we go about preventing this kind of underhand black market buying from terrorist groups with natural resources, operations in which directly fund ISIS, if we can't even get all of our allies on board for it?
Yeah, Michael, and that's a good example how a lot of these groups are funding themselves now, right? So they take over areas that have natural resources, like oil, and they certainly did that before the successful efforts of the global coalition to defeat ISIS took that territory back. And it's one of the reasons why the U.S. remained, is to ensure that those oil resources in Syria did not fall back into the hands of ISIS, because then they would essentially be able to fund themselves because of the very point you just made. If nobody was willing to buy the oil, then it would just be, mud. It wouldn't be any more valuable than mud. But people are willing to buy the oil, partly because it's cheap, as you already mentioned, but partly because a lot of the countries that do buy the oil are also on the outs, if you will, with the rest of the international community. So they're essentially doing so, not necessarily to propagate the ISIS mission, but because they've essentially, in their view, had nothing to lose, right? So whether it's the Assad regime or whether it's another country that's not so interested in what the rest of the world thinks.
If I were an accountant at the US Department of Defense, Seeing that they'd spent $1 trillion fighting a force that maybe pulls in 250 million, I'd be suggesting, well, why aren't we simply just approaching every Taliban soldier and paying them double or even triple what they're being paid right now? You know, even paying them quadruple to come work for us and stop fighting would be vastly cheaper than actually going and fighting the war the way we did. Is that a solution that's ever been considered by the Department of Defense?
So, I mean, that question, I think, if you look at the surge that happened in Iraq, one of the most effective parts of that was what's called the Sons of Iraq, which goes right to your question, Michael. In that, we, through the government, essentially funded this substantial policing force known as Sons of Iraq and paid their salaries. That effectively took a significant portion of the fighting age males in the Sunni population out of the pot for potential ISIS in Iraq and into the group that was about defending against ISIS in Iraq. So that would indicate that your theory does have merit. In Afghanistan, the people that came from the Afghan population, and I spent over 2.5 years in Afghanistan, that were inclined not to be part of the Taliban did join and did get paid as members of the Afghan National Army or the Directorate of Security, which is kind of like their intelligence, federal law enforcement equivalent. And they were essentially, they got a salary that came from mostly the United States. Those who were inclined to fight on the side of the Taliban didn't.
During the Cold War, we saw quite a number of terrorist proxy groups like the Mujahideen being funded by state actors like the US and the Soviet Union. But at the end of the Cold War, we saw a bit of a lull in state-sponsored terrorism. With that in mind, with state-to-state tensions increasing once again, do you think we might see a return to the widespread state-sponsored terrorist groups?
So I think it's going to be a combination, and I think explain that. I know that's kind of a cop-out, but if you look at the current situation, we have more and more countries that are potentially coming online, unfortunately, with nuclear weapons. I mean, according to media reports, Iran's at 60% enrichment. It would only take a matter of months to get to the level of enrichment to have weapons-grade uranium. And then now we'd have Iran with nuclear weapons. I bring this up because the preferred method of warfare has always been and likely will be irregular going forward. Conventional wars tend to make everybody losers. So if you look at it that way, I do think there'll be more funding of proxy forces by governments and more funding of terrorist forces by governments because they don't want to necessarily deal with the consequences to themselves. They would rather it be taken out on those forces. As a person who fought alongside those forces, at least the proxy forces, I have an attachment that others may not. But that's essentially what I can see being commonplace going forward. So who's funding them? So you're going to see a combination of state and citizens, for lack of a better term, individuals, I should say, funding groups that they believe in. Some of them are going to think it's more about the philosophy that they're supporting, whether it's domestic extremist organizations, and they're not really going to know that their money's going to violent activities. And some of it's going to be governments who simply see this as a way to disrupt their adversaries. For example, influence operations by the Russians in the United States to foment discord in our political system, which I think we've seen pretty strongly over the last few years. So it's going to be a combination, and it's going to be who supports who and who finds it advantageous to their goals to support these groups. I mean, we've even seen, and this is in the media, so I'm not, Iran basically housing senior Al-Qaeda leaders. On paper, that doesn't make any sense. They shouldn't be aligned, but they're, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. So I think we're going to see a mixture of self-funded terrorists people who join these groups who already have their money. We're going to see individuals that pay into one thing, thinking they're supporting some political aim, but it's also being used to do violent activities. And we're going to see governments, as they essentially always have, continue doing that to their own, national objectives as they see them.
So is this the new Cold War? State-sponsored groups cheaply fighting other state-sponsored groups, funded through telephone payment apps and Bitcoin, using third-party encrypted apps widely available to anyone to plan attacks. Are we going to see groups like Hezbollah dominate the international drug trade as they're being supplied and having their overheads paid for by Iran? It's a huge advantage to any competing cartels, and a factor that exponentially helps them take over more and more of the black market. This entire field of terrorism and recruitment is rapidly changing at the moment. In just 2001, Al-Qaeda was recruiting painfully slowly by sending scouts to mosques and schools and having to individually identify people who may be able to be persuaded. Just a decade later, we see ISIS being able to use online chat rooms, YouTube, and social media to recruit. And these days, a terrorist group can literally use the Facebook algorithm to exactly target likely recruits from around the world to either gather smaller, harder to trace donations or even encourage lone wolf attacks. Chaos has never been cheaper and easier to create. So is there a way of combating it? Is there something governments can do to slow the tide down? Well, for that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. Purchasing Plausible Deniability.
I started my career at the FBI in counterterrorism prior to 9/11 in the mid-1990s. At that time, if authorities were able to have their finger on the pulse on 3 basic types of activities, they basically knew everything they needed to know. And those were travel, communications, and financial transactions. And it was fairly straightforward. This was pre-social media. This was pre-electronic payments and M-payments on phones, certainly before crypto. And the nature of the business was very different. Now, in part because our adversaries have watched how we have addressed these problems, and they've taken actions to evade some of our capabilities. After 9/11, the effort to combat illicit finance, and in particular money laundering and terror financing, really picked up pace. The very first shot across the bow in the so-called war on terrorism was financial, with the creation of a new executive order, EO 13224, which empowered the United States to go after the money, and not just the money of the people who are actually pulling triggers or throwing bombs, but those who are supporting them, including maybe people who had shared ideological foundations but weren't going themselves or sending their kids to be fighters but would send money. And this was a real turning point. The next major turning point was less in the area of counter-terror finance and more in illicit finance more generally, when the U.S. In particular started figuring out how to leverage the private sector to deal with illicit financing by rogue regimes, in particular North Korea in the first instance, and later Iran. And so if you recall the situation with Banco Delta Asia in Macau around 2005 or so, a little earlier, this was a bank that was knowingly looking the other way for a fee as the North Korean regime was banking criminal proceeds and slush fund reserves there. And the U.S. government, the Treasury Department, took an action that was not actually an offensive action, but it was a defensive action to keep illicit finance out of the U.S. financial system, and said, look, Banco Delta Asia, if you're going to knowingly engage in this type of illicit finance, we can't let you into our system. But the ultimate effect of this 311 action, named for the Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act, was that it was kryptonite, and Banco Delta Asia effectively went out of business. And so you began to realize that by leveraging private sector forces where banks have fiduciary obligations to their shareholders. They have due diligence requirements. You can press those buttons, not to get them to do things that you want that they don't want to do, but to empower them to do the things they need to be doing for their own reputational risk and other concerns.
Matthew Levitt is the director of the Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He also lectures on combating financing and terrorism at Georgetown University. Matthew also formerly served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of Treasury, and in that capacity he has served as both the senior official within the department's Terrorism and Financial Intelligence branch, as well as Deputy Chief of Office of Intelligence and Analysis. We are thrilled to have him on the program today.
And then the final change, I would say, is much more recent and has to do with changes in social media communications, which has corollary changes in international finance, where people can crowdsource over the internet, people can move money virtually. But more to the point, a radicalization can inspire people around the world to do things in a like-minded kind of way as fellow travelers with some terrorist group, but without being a member of that group. And if you think back to those things we had back when I was at the FBI prior to 9/11, these individuals who are maybe foreign directed, but more often just inspired, they have never traveled anywhere to a terrorist training camp or anything. They've never sent or received money from bad guys. They are not even necessarily in communication, direct communication with them. And if they are, it's probably over an encrypted platform, or more generally just following stuff that's going on social media. And so most of our traditional tripwires that we've set in place for some 20 years simply are not relevant, or at least not as relevant, when trying to deal with the really difficult problem set of the lone offender. I don't like the term lone wolf for lots of different reasons, but the lone offender, someone who's actually acting on his or her own. And that's made a whole sea change in how we do things. And I'll throw out one last fourth kind of conceptual but very pragmatic way things have changed. And that is, there has been generally, again, in large part as a reaction to the way countries and institutions around the world have cracked down on terrorist financing, there's been a move by terrorist groups toward local financing. Think of it as funding in place to support global terrorist threats. And that has a lot to do with control of territory. So if you think of Shabab in Somalia or Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and the prime example, ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, the ability to tax local populations, the ability to extract funds from resources, whether they are renewable resources or one-time use resources, like raiding the central bank branch in Mosul. They did that once, but got hundreds of millions of dollars. This trend towards funding in place is significant, again, because it means that many of the tripwires we've put in place, which looked at transnational fund transfers, won't be as relevant. And so we've had to adapt.
For the most part, it is fairly easy to get individual citizens to comply with these anti-funding laws. But how do you convince large multinational banks or even nation states like North Korea or Iran to comply with these US laws?
Let's put that into three baskets: big states, small states, large private sector financial institutions, because it's different all around. It is true that sometimes you can put pressure on a small state and they'll take action. It's also true, however, that often they're just not capable of taking action or taking action on their own. And so, for example, Iraq, which had every interest in combating Islamic State finance when the Islamic State was holding significant swaths of territory of the country, didn't have the capabilities to do it on their own, didn't have the intelligence, didn't have the financial wherewithal. But when the United States or European powers came to them and worked with them to shut down, for example, target and shut down specific money exchange houses that were providing the Islamic State with connective tissue to the international financial system, meaning banks were all shut down within the territory that the Islamic State controlled in Iraq. By virtue of being able to reach out to exchange houses just in areas just outside their control, they were able to plug into the international financial system. By virtue of working with others, they were able to step up. So sometimes it's not just a matter of strong arming. In fact, I'd say more often it's a factor of empowering and creating the capability to do things even when some countries want to but aren't yet able. Larger countries, it's a different thing. It's not strong arming again, but it's demonstrating the shared interest. That tends to be fairly easy when definitionally the adversary is well defined, so Islamic State. But if it's something like Lebanese Hezbollah, where there are different understandings of how much of that organization should be considered a terrorist group, all of it, some of it, any of it. Or, for example, just thinking about another recent case that you might have seen in the media regarding the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, which is actually designated in whole as a terrorist group within the European Union, but some European Union member states are still not sure whether or not they should be cutting off funding to groups that are allied with the PFLP. In those types of cases, it has to do more with kind of financial and counterterrorism diplomacy and establishing a baseline for what has to happen. With the private sector, it can be more complicated. There is a real effort, and there has been for years now. It's still slow, but developing to build a kind of formal and informal mechanisms to be able to have public-private conversations between government and the private sector for lots of different reasons, so that the private sector is not over-filing suspicious activity reports, which they sometimes do. If there's any reason to be concerned, just file as a, cover your rear end reaction. But what that does for government is then you're swimming or really drowning in over-filing of all kinds of extra unnecessary SAR reports, suspicious activity reports. But also to be able to understand the risks that they could incur if they engage in certain types of risky behaviors. And so whether it's Deutsche Bank or many others in the United States or Europe or elsewhere, we see now that the private sector really is understanding the risks. We're seeing that the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, by virtue of setting standards and then doing national assessments, which have real implications if you get put on the gray list. I mean, the United Arab Emirates is now on the cusp of possibly being gray listed by the Financial Action Task Force. That has real consequences, and so they're taking real actions. Japanese banks, it was just reported today, are taking new action to try and track illicit finance through maritime trade because they've been found to be somewhat deficient by the Financial Action Task Force. So there are lots of ways to go about this, and I would argue that the least effective is strong arm tactics. Everybody, both countries and private sector, have an interest in protecting their own national and, more broadly, the international financial system from abuse.
One of your major areas of expertise is with Hezbollah, so let's use them as an example. Some reports suggest that Iran supports Hezbollah with around $200 million a year for their operations in the region. So that leads me to two questions. One, how do we actually attain an estimate on how much money Hezbollah has? And two, how does Iran actually get the money there? Because surely they aren't just filling suitcases with money and driving them from Tehran to Beirut.
So in the first instance, the amount of money it's assessed that Iran provides to Lebanese Hezbollah nowadays is significantly more than $200 million a year. The State Department now says, and has for a couple of years, that it's somewhere in the vicinity of $700 to $800 million a year, possibly more. It fluctuates without a doubt. Drops in the price of oil, impact of sanctions, seizures, all these things make a difference and can have significant impact. We've seen Hezbollah forced to prioritize funding its special operations activities in Syria and shutting down media and other offices, having to offer less payments to fighters who are not in the inner concentric circle of Hezbollah, but farther outside within the rings of support networks. But Hezbollah, while it still gets the vast majority of its money from Iran, also really, I'd say going back to the failed Green Revolution in Iran, has tried to diversify its financial portfolio. It doesn't worry that they'll wake up one morning and Iran simply won't love them anymore. There's a deep ideological bond between the revolutionary leadership in Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah. It's also very personal. But they are concerned that they could wake up one morning and circumstances can change such that even though Tehran might want to provide a certain amount of money, it might be unable to do so. And so they have diversified into abuse of charity in a way that they hadn't for some years. The Islamic Resistance Support Organization is a U.S. designated Hezbollah fundraising entity, a charity, if you will. Hezbollah's militia, its army, is called the Islamic Resistance. So Islamic Resistance Support Organization is kind of like, Lebanon, Hezbollah Army Support Organization. And they're quite blunt in the fact that the money they're raising is for militant purposes. It's been very, very active, even billboards in Lebanon, on social media, crowdsourcing, etc. And then they've always been engaged in some levels of criminal activity, but Hezbollah's engagement in criminal activity has really skyrocketed, and in particular through peripheral activities in the narcotics trade. That is to say that Hezbollah is not suddenly a cartel in South America, but they are acting as key facilitators for the cartels, moving product, and more importantly, laundering the proceeds of narcotic sales for the cartels and making a pretty penny in the interim. As for how Iran gets the money to Hezbollah, they've been forced to get a lot more creative, not only because the international community has done a lot to make it more difficult from the Hezbollah end of the spectrum, but also because they've done a lot to make it more difficult from the Iranian end of the spectrum. And you might assume that because of all of the financial hardship that Iran is under, would not have the funds to support groups like Hezbollah, but the case is the opposite. This is a regime that cares less about providing heating fuel to poor citizens than it is about funding its proxies and its nuclear program, and so it prioritizes things like regional proxy funding and the nuclear program over its own constituents. And it's been able to get that money where it wants to go, sometimes by things even as simple as putting millions of dollars in suitcases, which at one point is how they were getting money to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But in the case of Hezbollah in particular, we're talking about much more sophisticated illicit financial transfer actions, including through the oil industry, with Hezbollah operatives joining forces with senior Quds Force, Iranian Quds Force operatives, setting up front companies in Iraq, for example, to be able to make money off of shipments of oil that are either put into the international oil economy, made to look like Iraqi oil, or are sold to the Syrian government, which then provides some of the funds to Hezbollah or other groups. But at the end of the day, what for us is a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, for Iran is still the kind of money that it has available to it to finance its proxy groups.
I'm curious then, how do you combat money laundering when it's not in cash, when it's in oil or guns or diamonds? Because surely that makes tracking these transactions much harder.
So the Canadian government years ago wrote a really important paper published by FinTrack, noting that we really shouldn't be thinking about terror financing only in terms of cash. We should be thinking about it in terms of resourcing. And that broadens out the aperture to let us think about weapons procurement and about things like trade-based money laundering more broadly. So it's not just a question of moving money without money actually moving, say, through a hawala system where, I pay someone money here and the money is dispersed someplace else, but it never actually travels through the formal financial system. It's about, say, buying sugar or wheat or rice and sending that to a conflict zone, which doesn't set off the kind of alarms that sending large amounts of money to be dispersed in brown paper bags might set off. But then the terrorist group on the ground has the ability to consume that product, give it out to its supporters to build grassroots support, or to sell it and have the cash to use for whatever else it wants. So there are lots of ways to go about dealing with this. Here in the United States, Homeland Security Investigations out of the Department of Homeland Security has developed particular expertise in this type of trade-based money laundering schemes. Part of this is that if you want to be really successful in combating illicit finance, I would argue of any kind, you're going to have to build into your national capabilities the ability to leverage intelligence. Here in the United States, and so far as I know, it's the only place in the world that's developed this model. The U.S. Treasury Department has its own Office of Intelligence and Analysis, which is part of the U.S. intelligence community. Cards on the table. Once upon a time, I was the deputy chief of this office. But it doesn't have to be that you put an intelligence office in your Treasury Department, so long as your illicit finance components, whether it's regulators or law enforcement, have some type of connective tissue to your intelligence components so that you can have a better understanding of, wait, that's a suspicious ship that's been turning off its transponder and what have you, or this is a suspicious charity, or that's a suspicious business, for reasons that we wouldn't be able to spot if we didn't have access to some element of classified intelligence. But when you do pull together these various national elements of national power, so it's not just regulators working in a bubble and law enforcement working in a bubble and intelligence working in a bubble, and the intelligence maybe having more information but not having the authorities to actually act, and the people not having access to the information. When you put all this together, you sometimes will get big arguments about, well, should we do this or should we do that? But at the end of the day, you'll have a robust system. And I participated in some very heated meetings in the U.S. interagency when I was last in government, where we had information and the big debate was, well, what do we do? Do we do anything? Do you do something? Do I do something? At the end of the day, though, those meetings ended with the decision that someone was going to do something. And typically it ended up being that the best, smartest, most effective part of government would use their tool, as opposed to what was otherwise sometimes be kind of the lowest hanging fruit, or the most obvious but might not have been the most effective tool to use in that particular situation.
During the Cold War, state actors tended to be the ones backing terrorist groups. And with the new pseudo-Cold War starting to form, do you think we're going to start to see the return of state actors being much more involved in the funding of terrorist groups?
It's a great question, but I want to break it up into two parts. The first part is how relatively inexpensive terrorism is, and the second is whether we should expect to see more use of terrorist groups as proxy groups. So it's true, any particular act of terrorism is fairly inexpensive, and especially as we see an increase towards knife attacks and vehicular attacks, these are extremely inexpensive. But it's also the case that most actual organizations, leave aside for the moment the inspired lone offender, but the actual organizations, you mentioned Al-Shabaab, they have real expenses. They have real infrastructure costs. And to the extent they're trying to control territory, which Shabaab really is now, those costs can be extensive as they're trying to move their operations into neighboring countries, which Shabaab has done quite successfully. That costs money as they're trying to pay salaries, run clinics, do the things that groups do to build grassroots support. When they become not only kind of terrorist, but also insurgent groups running territory, those costs are significant. And so while on the one hand, it's true that the Islamic State ultimately became the richest terrorist group we've ever known, it also had the most significant costs. And the flip side to that is that as the Islamic State faced battlefield defeat, and therefore lost access to significant amounts of money, and a lot of people started taking great comfort in that, I and others were saying, yeah, that's really good, don't get me wrong, but they're also, as their territory shrinks, they have far fewer costs, and so they can afford to lose income. And so the question is, what's the ratio of your cost to your income? And so there's a lot we have to do still, especially with groups that control territory, where there's a lot of money moving around. Hamas doesn't need as much money as Hezbollah does. Hezbollah doesn't need as much money as the Islamic State did, but they all require significant amounts of money. Now, what you mentioned about great power competition potentially leading to more support for terrorism is a really important concept. We certainly saw an increase in that type of activity as the Cold War progressed. And you saw both great powers and regional powers, powers that, for example, had a lot of income from rentier economies like oil economies, sponsoring terrorist groups. Then with the end of the Cold War, we saw a little bit of a dip, not necessarily in terrorism, but in how terrorism financing happened. And for a period of time, we saw state sponsorship become a lot less important. And according to some theories, because there wasn't state sponsorship, which can also come with, strings attached. We don't want you to do things that are too crazy because that could boomerang back on us. Without those restraints, some terrorist groups became even more violent and more radical as they found other sources of financing. And now we're seeing that come around again as states are recognizing how effective it is to use proxy groups. Iran in particular has significantly beefed up its network of proxy groups throughout the Middle East. Russia is seeing the advantage of working through proxy groups, mercenaries, dispatching little green men, providing Air Force cover in Syria to others who will fight on the ground. And I think that this is something that we may see increase, this idea of providing small amounts of money to other people to do your fighting for you, not necessarily because of some deeply shared ideological convictions like you have between Iran and Hezbollah, though we'll still have that, but also just out of common interest. And so if you think back, going back for some time now, the way Iran has periodically provided safe haven to small numbers of al-Qaeda leaders in Iran, sometimes imprisoning them, sometimes putting them under house arrest, sometimes not having them under house arrest. Even as Iran hates al-Qaeda, there was an element of my enemy's enemy is my friend, and I can control you as long as you don't attack me and you're attacking somebody else. There is a danger of seeing that type of relationship increase given the nature of where the world is going today.
So what are the solutions that government should be looking at to combat these issues right now? Because we seem to be quite behind the eight ball on a number of these fronts.
There's no silver bullet here. There's no panacea. There's a lot of small things that are being done and need to be done to be able to constrict the operating environment and make it more difficult for illicit actors to engage in the various activities across the financial spectrum that they need to engage in to be able to raise money, to launder money, to store money, to transfer money, to access money. And I think it's important to recognize that there are elements and levels of success in counter illicit finance across that spectrum. We should not be measuring our success only in terms of have we seized enough terrorist money. It's also success, maybe not as much as a success, but it's also success if you haven't seized the money, but you've also done things to prevent them, bad guys, from accessing it, or even accessing it in time to do what they wanted to do. I do think that there is a need to work much more closely between public and private sectors. Neither is in a position to be able to do everything they need to do on their own. I do think that there is a need to move beyond the focus on cash, actual currency in terrorist and illicit financing, and looking more broadly at trade-based money laundering and other types of financing, which is not new at all, to be sure, but is significantly on the rise. I think that we need to think hard about how to best create connective tissue between our regulators, our law enforcement, and our intelligence communities when it comes specifically to illicit finance. And I think finally we have to find ways to wrap our heads around and our systems around the fast-paced change that's going on with social media and cryptocurrency, blockchain technology more broadly. I don't want to put this all into the cryptocurrency and blockchain basket. We do have cases where those have been used to finance terrorism, but they're actually relatively far and few between. And they're not as anonymous as the bad guys tend to think they are, which is good for us trying to stop them. But more generally, social media has created all kinds of opportunities, not only for communication, but also for finance and communication about finance, crowdsourcing and other things. And we need to be able to get our heads wrapped around that. I honestly think that not just in countering terror finance, but countering radicalization and terrorism more broadly, the biggest challenge we have is in trying to put the social media genie a little bit back in the bottle. We allowed private sector companies to build these tools very, very quickly. These tools have tremendous power for good, but it turns out that without any regulation, without any oversight, they're also tremendously vulnerable to being abused by bad actors for a variety of different means. And we're playing catch up on that. That's what gives me, in some ways, my greatest concern.
The US sits in a pretty weird middle ground at the moment, with their huge military stance unparalleled, and on paper they could defeat multiple nations simultaneously, all whilst living with the reality of the defeats in Vietnam and Afghanistan, and even Iraq and Syria you wouldn't really call victories. The US were outlasted by groups spending less than 1% of what the US was. Or as a friend of mine who served in Afghanistan told me, it doesn't matter if you have the best fighter jet in the world, if your opponent is just using a backpack bomb or simply a truck to do the damage. So how do you combat terrorist funding? How can you actually starve these groups of resources? Do you analyze every single transaction from every citizen around the world in the hope that you catch that $30 John Smith sends to a man in Syria? Well, doing that raises a lot of privacy issues and questions. And do you give that sort of power to private banks to observe everything? You'll need to if you want a good chance of catching the bad guys, but we saw what can happen when private companies have that much data with these still deepening Equifax leaks. People have a right to privacy, but will John Smith care that the government didn't know he purchased a Downtown Abbey box set at 3 a.m. if someone attacked his local football game with explosives? Since 9/11, the balancing act between privacy and security has been a sword of Damocles hanging above the US system. Terrorism isn't going away. In fact, it's getting cheaper and easier than ever to recruit and carry out attacks now than it ever has been before. Today, a man with a knife and mental health issues can make worldwide news, putting your terrorist group in front and center for the entire eyes of the world, which in turn makes it easier to recruit even more people. So what should the US do? Should they re-embrace funding counter-terror groups like they did with the Mujahideen in the 80s or the anti-communists in Italy with the 50s? After all, these groups achieved fantastic results for a fraction of the cost. Then again, you can also look at operations like Desert Storm in the South China Sea and see cases where the F-35 really does show its use, where the big spending items are actually game changers. But which of those would be more crucial for the US going forward? State-to-state conflicts or counter-terrorism/insurgency battles? That's the big question for the US going forward. I'll leave you this week on an analogy I heard from an analyst friend of mine. The US strategy for fighting terrorism has become like trying to fight a beehive with a sledgehammer. Yes, with that big sledgehammer you can smash that beehive, you can break it into pieces, but when you're being swarmed directly afterwards by an angry horde of bees, your heavy, clunky sledgehammer can do very little to help you. Thank you so much for tuning into the show this week. This is our first episode of 2022, and we wanted to start it off with a really niche and deep analytical piece. This year for us will be the busiest we've ever done, creating extra analysis and special mini-series, as well as more content for our website. All of which can be found by visiting www.theredlinepodcast.com. So if you want to keep up to date and make sure you don't miss anything, you can find all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle MikeHilliardOz. Oz is in Australia. This episode is dedicated to good friend of the show, Robertson Barnes, who is the latest Patreon to sign up as of time of this recording. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like Rob, who donate a small amount of money each week to help us keep this show going, and we really cannot thank you enough. If you feel you could spare a couple of dollars, we'd really appreciate it. But for now, Rob, this episode about terrorist funding models is all thanks to you. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is Hezbollah, The Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God, by Matthew Levitt, all about how terrorist funding works with Hezbollah. The second is The Terror Years by Lawrence Wright, all about the lead up to 9/11 and the war in Iraq, as well as the interagency rivals that formed holes in the US intelligence services. The third is Terrorism Inc. by Colin P. Clark, going through the practices these groups use to fund their operations. I want to thank this week's guests, John Coyne, Mick Mulroy, and Matthew Levitt. All of you were absolutely amazing to work with on this one, and we look forward to having you back on the show soon. I also want to thank my staff, Owen Swift, the producer, Perry Grace and Daniela Zuvella, senior writers and researchers, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Ross Crabtree, our new media specialist, and has been helping us make and produce some amazing breaking news content on our TikTok channel, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, Nick Mutch, our field correspondent, as well as Jonah Gunn and Robert Sutton, our new production assistants. I know I say it every single time, but I really am incredibly proud of the team we have here at the show, and I'm looking forward to all the goals we'll kick in 2022. The Red Line will be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.